or unmuted for the live stream to hear me, but in case I was muted that whole time, we're just going to get into the seminar. I'm wearing a wig because of opening night. Anyway, judging basics. This is how to judge the format. We have an option at club night that if you wanted to, instead of speaking in a debate, if you wanted to do something called traineeing. So traineeing and debating, especially in New Zealand, most other countries don't have this system, but in New Zealand debating, we have a system called accreditation. So that means that to be a judge that can officially judge at the major New Zealand tournaments, which are joint and officers, you have to be an accredited judge. So you kind of have to go through this process called training, and other old people be like, oh, are they good at judging? Do they know what's going on? Can you give a good eye? It's a really weird process. I have a seminar on it, but this is helping you get towards that training process in a way that you'll accredit and then be a really fun and cool judge. So let's get started. Yeah, we've already kind of been through this. Debating just isn't about actually giving the speeches. It's also competitive when you're judging the speeches. So at Worlds, at Australs, which is the 3v3 major tournament, you compete with other judges to be there's a best judge award, and you can do something called breaking. So breaking is when you break from the in rounds to the final rounds. So it basically just means that you've been a really high quality judge at the tournament, and so they're going to let you judge the final rounds because they trust that you've done a good job. So it's kind of, you can get awards for it. It's equally as competitive. I'd encourage everyone, if you are interested in law or interested in just, critical thinking, that kind of thing, and don't really so much like speaking yourself, judging is a really good option for you to still get involved in debating, just in a different way. So here's some examples of how you can get involved as a judge. It's a little bit different for British Parliamentary because most of the schools debating that happens in New Zealand is in the 3v3 format. So you won't be able to get any experience really at that really beginner level. But what you can do is training at our club nights. And then there are lots of online tournaments if you want to take it to that next step that run in the British Parliamentary format. You can do those if you want to upskill yourself and be a really good VP judge. But here's some examples. Yeah. Now we're going to get into the actual meat of the seminar after me just rambling on and on about debating and everything, how to actually judge British Parliamentary. And just so that it makes sense, the seminar, the first part is written from with the assumption that you're chairing the debate. So in debating, there can be more than one judge judging a debate. If you are judging by yourself, you'll be called a solo chair. And chairing the debate basically just means that you're the boss, you're in charge, you kind of do all of the admin on top of deciding who wins. And if there is more than one judge, so there will always be an odd number just to prevent, even split. One person thinks it's one way, one person thinks it's another. That doesn't really work. So what happens is there'll be panels of odd numbers between 3. If it's a huge, really important debate, it's the final of a tournament, there could be 5. At Throppy, there'll be a panel of 17 people. So, scales up depending on importance, or I think Throppy is really important. So perhaps probably the largest panel that I've ever seen. So chairing means that you do all the admin. So the seminar is going to explain all of the admin that you have to do as a judge. If you're a panelist, all you have to do is come to a decision. So you don't have to do all of the admin. You just have to say, I think this was the ranking that happened as a debate. And if you're a trainee, you just have to come to a decision as well and come up with some reasoning for it. But you don't even have to worry too much about your decision even being correct, unless you want to accredit, and it's at a tournament where you can accredit. At club night, no pressure at all, just do your best. So the first responsibility of the chair is to give introductions in the debate. So in British Parliamentary, if you want to know more about the format itself, I did a seminar last week about speaking in British Parliamentary. But what introductions you will give as a judge is that after the 15-minute prep is finished, but before the debate begins, so before the Prime Minister gets up and starts their speech, you should make sure that everyone has had the chance to introduce themselves. And if they're comfortable in university debating, they should be encouraged to share their pronouns. So note here that some people will be like a little bit anti this and be confused about why they have to do this. It's because you looking at a person doesn't mean that you absolutely for certain can say that you know their pronouns. Just ask people. And if they say nothing, just use gender neutral. It's debating. Don't worry about it. You can just refer to them as a speaker position. If they're the Prime Minister, just call them the Prime Minister. That's what the debate asks you to do. After you've done all of that, so everyone's given their name, where they're speaking. So for example, you'd say, okay, I'd like to invite the opening government team to introduce themselves. And then you'd note down their names so that you can remember when you're writing their scores, who their names are, so that the people who are entering the scores into whatever database, that's usually called tabbing. If people talk about tabbing, that's what that means. It's just when you're entering data into a tab. So that's the purpose of you collecting that information. So you should always start in order from you. So start by introducing yourself. So I would say, hi, my name's Melissa. I'll be chairing this round and my pronouns are she, her. And then you'd ask your panelists to introduce themselves, or if you have any trainees, you'd ask them to introduce themselves as well. And then finally, ask all of the speakers in order of where they speak to introduce themselves. If you're really formal, you can also read out the motion. I think this is really good to do, especially at a junior level where you're judging. Sometimes people will mess it up. It's really good to pick up that they've messed it up before the debate starts in case you need to like rearrange things. The second responsibility of the chair is after you've got introductions. So this is a good idea if you've remembered everyone's names, if you can introduce each speaker as they're about to start to speak by their name. If you can't remember, and I'm often too lazy to remember like off by heart, you can just call them by their speaking position. So to start the debate, you would say, I would now like to invite up the Prime Minister to start the debate. And then at the end of that Prime Minister's speech, you would say, I thank the Prime Minister for their speech. I'd now like to invite up the Leader of the Opposition. So you're just kind of, giving that admin in between each speeches to help the debates flow smoothly, prompt people to come up so they know what's going on, and, remind everyone of the order of the speeches. So the example here is just another name of a speaker in the debate. I thank the government member for their speech. I now invite up the opposition member. Next responsibility that you have is to keep time. Some tournaments will have like a set person that keeps the time and does like POI claps. Most tournaments, the chair will have that responsibility. So you should have a little timer on your phone. There are actually people that made apps to keep time in debating. Love the little collab between software engineers that like to debate. So go them, I guess. I would never know how to do this. The one for iOS, I think, is called Debate Keeper, and then the other one is called Time Kept, or it might be the other way around. Android is called Debate Keeper, and then iOS is called Time Kept. Either variation, you can download them, and they have the option to, you can switch between all of the formats that exist in debating, and it will set up a timer for you, so you don't need to remember, okay, here's when POIs open. It will literally ring a buzzer when POIs open and when POIs close. If you're doing it the old-fashioned way, like me, because you're too lazy to download apps, what you can do is just use the timer app on your phone and just try and glance down so that when you see that 1 minute go, you clap like this, and then you wait for the next 5 minutes of that speaker's speech. Then at 6 minutes, you clap again, and it just lets everyone know in the room that between those two claps, the speakers on the other bench can jump up and ask a point of information. If a speaker offers a point of information outside of these 5 minutes, that would be your job to say, hey, sorry, no, you're out of time. And then they wouldn't be able to offer that point of information. Most speakers should be actually timing what's happening themselves, because it helps to keep things going smoothly and helps them do better at the debate, but sometimes they forget. I always forget as a speaker. So ultimately, it falls back on you to keep the time. At 7 minutes, you should double clap. And that kind of just lets them know that, that's it, buddy. Speech is done. You've got to your allotted time. If they get to 7:15, triple clap. And then if you're feeling particularly obnoxious at triple clap, sometimes they get lazy, especially with school speakers, because they're doing nothing but filling that time with just words, no meaning to them. Keep clapping. I'm not listening anymore. It's, you've filled up your allotted time. 7:30 is too far. Just stop where you are. Make sure that, especially if they're particularly nervous, be a little bit nicer. But if someone's filling up your time just for the sake of it, make sure that they know that their time is over. The fourth responsibility of the chair is to create a safe environment for teams. I'd say that this is especially important if you're judging something like a schools tournament or something where people are very, very new to debating and so don't really know the norms or don't know the people there, because debating can be scary, especially if you aren't particularly confident with public speaking, or just going somewhere where you don't really know anyone. It's really scary. So have a little bit of empathy and be nice. Something that happens sometimes, especially when we debate like literally everything, and that can include sensitive topics, especially topics that are sensitive to some people in particular. That's your responsibility to make sure that you're vibe checking the room constantly, and that if someone is saying something that's attacking someone's protected attributes, so like their race or their gender, or even other statuses that you'll find out about in equity briefings, just stop the speech there if it's really terrible and just say, hey, maybe reevaluate your argument. It's not really equitable what you're saying right now, and then ask them to continue with a different perspective. If the debate as a whole, and everyone's being a bit not very considerate about, just being a bit nasty to each other, saying particularly like thoughtless things, then you would, between speeches, just give reminders to say, hey guys, remember that you have to consider what's equitable when you're giving your speeches, because at the moment, some of the arguments aren't being based off logic and reasoning. They're being based off just random insults and baseless, thoughtless things. So that as a whole will usually prompt speakers to be better. But if a speaker comes up to you and they're quite upset and they feel like they need someone to talk to you, I would encourage you to talk to the equity officer. That's why we have them. If there's issues that happen, it's their job to make sure that they follow up and make sure that that person is okay. So, reminder that our equity officer is Grace. She's lovely. Sometimes she really scares me in debating because she's really good at it, but she's a lovely person. So you should go and find her at club night and I can point her out to you. She always introduces herself and has a separate, slide thing that reminds you how to be equitable at club night. In the end, just be a good person. Like, you don't need to be worried about, oh my God, am I going to make an equity violation? Because if you're being a normal person, most actions are not an equity violation. If you're saying openly problematic things in a debate, that's when it becomes an equity violation. Last responsibility of the chair is to manage deliberation between judges. So all of the last responsibilities before are things that you do just before and during the debate. This last responsibility is something that you do at the end of the debate when the teams have been sent away, they've finished their speeches, and it's just you and the other judges in the room. If it's just you and you're a solo judge and you don't have anyone to deliberate with, your job is so easy. You just have to argue with yourself about what order you thought the teams fell in. If you are a chair and you have panelists, then you would deliberate with them and you have to come to a consensus decision about what the ranking of the teams was. So consensus means that you all have to come to some agreement about the order of teams. That's different to in 3v3. In 3v3, in a panel of 3 people, one person can think it went to F and the other 2 judges can think it went to neg, and the debate will go to the negative team because the debate will go with the majority. In this format, all judges have to, even if it's reluctantly, you have to agree that, okay, this team was first, this team was second, this team was third, and this team was fourth. You might start, like, because you'll read out your rankings to each other, you might start with different opinions. You have to talk to each other and explain why, you know, one order is the correct order until you reach a consensus. So that means that in big contentious finals, like the world's final that just went on a couple of days ago, the deliberation can take up to many hours. So sometimes it'd be like that. Usually in university debating here, that doesn't happen because I don't know about you, but there's lots of social events and I would like to go to those social events. I don't want to be trammed by 2 hours. So no, please try your best to not do that. But in important finals, you should take lots of care to think about what is the right decision. So this is how to actually judge the debate. That's just kind of some admin things that you have to do. So like you have to be like, hey guys, what was your order? Oh, okay, why did you think that way? And can we take a vote on what the order is going to be? This is how you actually listen to the debate and come up with the reasoning and come up with the order and justify that order. So this is more the actual process of what you'll do rather than just like the formal things that you have to do to make the debate flow smoothly. And also I'd just like to note that all of this is based on the world's judging manual, because sometimes my thoughts are not consistent with the rest of the community. They are my own thoughts. So I thought I'd refer to some authority before I try and teach people something that's wrong. So if anyone wants to call me out for this, I'm literally citing the world's manual. Please don't hate me. First thing is I think it's really important that lots of people just be like, oh, just judge. And that's completely a new concept to you and you have no idea what they mean by that. So I'm going to start right from the basics of how you set up your page so that you can take notes in a way that help you turn that into a decision that you explain to the teams. So the best way to judge is by knowing what you're going to do before you listen to the debate. So have a planned method to take notes. What that method is up to you, but I'm going to suggest one just so that you have something to go from as you start. You might change it up as you go along. That's all good, up to you. First step is that you can do it on paper or digitally. Just split your paper in half or, you know, make a table in Word or in Google Docs and have 2 columns. On one side, you will write notes for the government side. So on one side, if you're comparing the first 2 speakers, the Prime Minister will be on one side and the leader of the opposition will be on the other. What this means is that you can kind of, when you're listening to each speech, have an idea of how they merge with each other, because what you're trying to do is compare them. You're trying to think about, okay, they said this, but how does that compare to the thing that other teams said? Or maybe they'll be like, they'll make a really big claim that the other team said something really problematic, but then the other team didn't even actually say that. You need to actually have notes and remember what the other team said so that you can make that judgment, because sometimes you'll fall into the trap of a really persuasive speaker telling you how to see the debate, but the way that they're telling you to see the debate actually didn't happen. So you got to police that and be a good judge. Second thing is after you've split your page in half, make sure you reserve a place at the bottom for you where you record all of the details that you need to send to like the tab team or send to the people that are in charge of the tournament running at the end. So what that means is in a Google Doc or on paper, you reserve a space or you make another cell in your table, and in there you put what you think the speaker score the speaker should have in there, so that's a separate space and you don't lose it. And you also put some notes that aren't just taking notes about what they said, taking notes about, okay, I think they could have done this better. Maybe they could have had better structure, so that you have something to refer to when that speaker asks for feedback. And also write some ideas about, okay, this is where I think the debate is going, so that you can refer back to that when you're thinking about your judgment, so that it makes sense for yourself on reaching a decision. Hope that makes sense, but that's just the basics of setting up your page. Moving now to listening to the debate. So this is where the actual like meat happens of what you do as a judge, is you listen to speakers And from that listening, you have to evaluate the arguments and whether you're persuaded by it and whether you're persuaded by it more than the other teams in the debate. Because note that the metric for judging is in BP is that you have who you think is the winner or who you think is the team that gets first is the team that makes the best contribution to the debate. So that contribution can take many forms, but that's essentially what you're listening for, and you're ranking speakers based on that. While you're listening to the debate specifically, though, this is what I got from the World's Manual, is you have to listen from the perspective of the average reasonable voter. So as the average reasonable voter, judges should firstly avoid using personal knowledge. So this applies a lot to, like, you know, the Joe Ashcrofts of the world that have PhD in economics. So like if some guy's talking about really complex economic theory, the actual Joe Ashcroft knows all about it and could thinks this is the best contribution ever, but the average reasonable voter doesn't have a PhD in economics. So the debate should actually be judged from that average reasonable voter's perspective. So if they don't give enough explanation to that economic theory, then it can't just stand in the debate just because they throw it out. So if, for example, they'd be like, and we know this is true because of insert economic theory. They didn't explain what that was, right? They just threw it in there because they know that Joe Ashcroft has a PhD and will be able to understand what that means. But me, I have no idea what that means. So they actually needed to give that more explanation for it to make sense. And because we want the judging quality to be consistent, we would both make the same conclusion that needed more explanation rather than someone just assuming that it makes sense. So the example from the World's Manual is that you can make basic assumptions like Syria is in the Middle East because, you know, that's pretty, you know, someone with average media consumption would know that, or Russia is a major oil producer, because if you watch the news, you'd probably be able to conclude that. But other examples, too far, probably needs more explanation. The next thing that you should do as an average reasonable voter is give little credit to appeals that merely are targeted at emotion or authority, except where these are given, where these have rational influence on an argument. So a person can't win a debate just by being really emotive, right? They can't win a debate just that they're not making a really, really valuable contribution just by really being an authoritative and emotional speaker. But maybe that bumps them up another 1 or 2 speaker points if it does add to the really important things that they're saying in their speech. So maybe you're talking about something really tragic or something that really, really is important. And to stress that importance, you be emotive or you be authoritative. But by virtue of you being emotive, you don't get extra points. It has to kind of come with the good analysis that you're bringing to the debate. The next thing that you should do is avoid presuming a geographic, cultural, national, ethnic, or other background when assessing arguments. So you're not being like, oh, I'm the average reasonable New Zealand voter, I'm the average reasonable American voter, or I'm the average reasonable woman voter. You're just a blob. You're just a person. You don't have any characteristics. You're just like a combination of all people in the world, and you're making just a very average, not average in quality, but just average in perspective decision on what basis the arguments have. So what this looks like in debating is that lots of times, especially in just New Zealand tournaments or at club night, you'll notice it as well, is that people tend to use just New Zealand examples, or maybe they'll stray and pick out a few American examples, but you can't, when you're judging a debate, give unfair weight to those examples. So if one team exclusively brings New Zealand examples and another team brings a range of examples about places around the world, you can't give more weight to those examples just because they're from New Zealand and because you know more about them. You have to give fair, equal weighting to all things that are brought into the debate. You should also avoid preferencing arguments or styles speaking that match personal preferences. This is a given, but I don't want to name names. Some judges just really like certain styles, and unfortunately that tends to be that of white men. So don't do that, okay? Don't be that judge. That's really sad and annoying, especially when you're me and you go to some tournaments and bad things happen and you get scored weirdly. Don't do that. if it's, if a woman has a different way of speaking to a man, which, often they do, just because they're speaking differently doesn't mean it's better or worse. Weigh the actual arguments in their speech rather than their speaking style too heavily. And then finally, you should be assessing the merits of a proposed policy, solution, or problem separate from any personal perspectives in relation to it. So, for example, it might be a debate about universal basic income. You could think that's the most terrible idea in the world, but got to put that opinion to a side for the debate. You have to think about, okay, in this debate, which team has made the best argument that it's a good thing? Because sometimes that might be different to what your personal opinion is. And it's hard to remove this bias because you might accidentally start filling in the gaps where a team hasn't made the full argument that you think that their argument is. But that's how you become a good judge, right? Is trying to stop yourself from filling in those gaps and just seeing the debate for what it is and assessing which team has made the best contribution based on what actually happened in the debate. Does anyone have any questions about this? Yes.
Just a question on, the example you were saying. So if someone was to just give these other examples and someone was to bring in different countries, would you think like one is better than the other, or would you say they're both equal?
Well, I guess it depends the way they link it into the debate. Usually when they're linking in lots of examples from a range of areas, what that does is prove that their world works in a broad range of areas rather than only working in New Zealand. Like, for example, if it's like a political debate, some things will only work in New Zealand because of New Zealand's political environment, like, the way people think or the way people want to vote or the way that our other political institutions are set up. So one team could make their arguments more convincing by proving that it works even in America, even in China, even in Russia. And that will be more convincing because their policy stands even in a range of examples of political environments. That's usually the way that it's weaved in, is that when you're bringing in a range of examples, it demonstrates that you're bringing more layers and thinking about more scenarios of your argument rather than just one. But when you're judging, automatically, because you understand the New Zealand examples by virtue of living here a little bit more than some others, for example. Maybe you understand the other ones more, but it's just trying not to bring that perspective in and giving those New Zealand examples too much weight when the other examples could actually be making that argument seem really, really flexible and works regardless of the location of the debate. Does anyone have any other questions? Okay, so good. We'll move to the next slide. After you've listened to the debate, the unfortunate thing that you have to do in debating is make a decision. You can't just let everyone win. So judges judge debates by assessing without prejudice which team in the debate was the most persuasive. So note here in BP, you are ranking the teams from 1 to 4 instead of just picking a winner or a loser. So when you're thinking about this, the persuasive of an argument in British parliamentary debating, and I'm pretty much copied and pasted from the World's Manual, so if it's wordy, that's not me, it's World's people, is rooted in the number of plausible reasons that are offered to show that it is true and important, and the clarity and rhetorical power with which these reasons are explained. So, as you can see in brackets, you have matter and manner. I don't know if any of you guys know Claire Ryan, but she really loves formulaic judging. She has little categories and everything. That's an aside. But basically what happens is you're thinking about the analysis or the matter that you heard in the debate. So what the teams actually reasoned, what they argued. And then on top of that, as a little bit of an embellishment, you shouldn't weight this too heavily because lots of style and lots of manner being like my speaking style or how loud I was or how quiet I was or how fast I was. A lot of how good you think a style is weighted in personal preferences. So I don't think that you should give heaps of weight to the matter, but for example, if a speaker is really good at wording things or uses really well well done sentences. They have full stops in their sentences, which is really hard for debaters actually. So those kinds of things you can reward because they make the speech better, because it makes it clearer. But primary thing that you're weighing is what teams actually said in the debate and whether that persuaded you. So in BP, apparently they don't separate it. I think this is probably the best way to go about it, but I think it's worthy to note that the matter is the most important thing when you're thinking about persuasiveness. Yeah, they say that an argument can't be persuasive just because it was stylish. I agree. There's nothing persuasive in speaking a sentence clearly and powerfully if that sentence is not in fact a reason for an argument. But equally, reasons for an argument that cannot be understood by a judge cannot persuade them. So hopefully, just as a summary, matter matters more because it's about what reasoning was the best. And if you could understand that reasoning because of the way a speaker spoke it to you, don't have accent bias, that's also a protective attribute. But if you could understand it well, that means that that's working well for the speaker and you should be awarding them like higher depending on whether they had the best explanation and had a good style while doing it. So the analysis behind an argument consists of the reasons offered in support of it. So reasons can support arguments in a number of different ways, none of it is in itself better or more important. So here are some examples of reasons that you can be persuaded by things that I've gotten from the World's Judge Manual. So firstly is logically explain why an argument is true. Secondly, present evidence or empirical evidence for an argument. Thirdly is describe casually why a certain outcome will come, causally why a certain outcome will come about. Identify widely shared moral intuitions in favor of an argument, expose a damaging logical implication of a contrasting argument, and identify an emotive response that encourages us to care about a certain outcome. So to summarize all of these bullet points in debaterisms, which I'll explain, because this is incredibly wordy and I love that they were specific, but I like to use casual terms even in debates because it's fun. Firstly, if you explain why something's true, that's something that can be persuasive. So if they say, here's my statement, here are 5 reasons why the statement is true, that's really persuasive, you should weigh that. Secondly, if you're presenting evidence and you're saying, here's how long this war in Syria has been going on, we need to end it, here's how many children die, here's how awful, here's all of the weapons that they're using on them, you're presenting that evidence, that's something that you can be persuaded by. Thirdly, if you're explaining why an outcome will happen, so if you're explaining, here's why the suffering in Syria will end if Russia stops using weapons there. If you give that explanation, that's something that the judge should be convinced by. Next, when you are explaining what happens as a result of the other team's argument, so for example, the other team gives a example or they give a mechanism. A mechanism is like the reasons why something is true. If they give a mechanism but they haven't explained it all the way to the end, and you explaining it to the end actually means that the reverse is true. So for example, if you're explaining that, or actually if Russia stops supplying weapons in Syria, here's why this extremist group takes over, you can be convinced by the other team explaining the actual outcome of the other team's argument. So it's about, if a team explains the actual logical result of an outcome, then you're allowed to be persuaded by that. Finally, if a speaker uses emotive language and emotive speaking style that encourages you to care about a certain outcome, then you're allowed to care about that. A lot of debates turn, or a lot of contributions can be made more significant by you explaining why the judge should care about a certain thing. Because what happens in debating a lot is that you have 4 teams in the debate, all of them have made points that are true, but you as a judge have to pick the issue that's the most important. So you should also be persuaded by whichever team gives you the best explanation of why you should care about their issue the most. Because you might not necessarily always be able to disprove the points of every other team, but what you can do is prove why your points are true and are more important than every other team's point in the debate. So that's the kind of weighing that you're doing as a judge. You're not just saying, okay, was X team right and was Y team wrong? You're trying to understand the debate from the perspective of, okay, perhaps all teams are right. Which team solved the issue that was the most important? Which team made the best contribution? And that's essentially what weighing is. Again, doing this from the perspective of the ordinary intelligent voter. And yeah, you can weigh things differently depending on how precise they are. So maybe they're, oh yeah, did you have a question?
Yeah, I was just, so if a team has, like, says this is going to be the outcome, and the team after them says, oh, this is actually how it's going to be, do you have to give credit to that, or do you just take which one you think, like, or which one convinces you the most?
It depends. Yeah, it depends which one has given the best reasoning, because then you'll be weighing them against each other to determine, okay, this team, the first team just said, oh, and this will happen. And they didn't say why it was going to happen. They just said it was going to happen. And the second team says, oh, actually, this will happen. And here's why this will happen. You'd weigh the second one more because that team's given reasons why that link will happen. But if the first team actually did give links, they said, this will happen and here's why. And the other team does the reverse. They say, actually, this will happen and here's why. Then you'd come all the way down to the end and have to weigh those reasons against each other. And that's, the nitty gritty of what a judge does. They have to weigh from the perspective of an average reasonable voter. Do I buy that? Do I even get that? Do I need a PhD in economics to understand that? If yes, got to wipe that away, because someone that watches the news isn't going to figure that out by themselves. But people with actual PhDs might. So I always say this, but it's just so true. Debating is just a vibe check. So if they don't pass the vibe check, maybe they're not going to be ranked as highly. If they do, that's when you're putting them towards the top. That's how you learn, right? The first step in being a good judge is getting the call right. The reasoning can come later. That's what you learn when you start to get more involved in debating. You listen to more debates, you hear judges give reasoning, you hear speakers give reasoning, then you learn their language, because we literally do speak in a different language and use really weird terms. It's really funny, but sometimes can be quite intimidating. You'll learn all of those terms, and then you can learn how to give those really advanced OAs. Okay, another slide of weighing the debate. Before I do this one, were there any more questions? Okay, I will do this. I think this is the last slide on weighing. So who wins a debate will be determined by which team best persuades you that they fulfill their burden. Burdens are a really important part of debating. So here's how you as a judge can find burdens in the debate. Just to summarize, a burden is basically what the team has to prove to be successful as that team. So each team in British Parliamentary will have a different burden. As a step back from debating, if you're being really meta is just when you're breaking the fourth wall. In debating, being meta means you're talking about how you're in a debate, and judge, you have to give us first, like those kinds of things. That's meta. When most teams in British Parliamentary, their burden is to be the team that gives the biggest contribution. So their burden is to give a big contribution. What that contribution is different depending on the debate and different depending on what team they are. So opening teams and closing teams will have different burdens to each other. They might be similar, but they'll always be slightly different. So how you find them in debating in BP is, firstly, it might be implied from the motion itself. So this is example from World's Manual. The motion here is that this House would prioritise the vaccination of law-abiding citizens in the case of major epidemics. So in this debate, the government teams would need to demonstrate that in major epidemics, the vaccination of law-abiding citizens should be prioritized. And then by extension, the opposition teams would have to argue the opposite of that. So at the end of the debate, for the government team to rank highly, you need to believe that they've proven in some way that government teams, that law-abiding citizens should be prioritized for vaccination in major epidemics. If they haven't proved that, they can do that in different ways. If they haven't proved that, then they haven't fulfilled their burden, and that means that they are not going to do well or win the debate. Second way that you can find burdens, and most likely in debates where it's not as obvious from the motion, is when the teams actually set up burdens for themselves, or the specific arguments that they choose to run mean that they have set themselves a burden. So the example here is that this House believes that assassination is a legitimate tool of foreign policy. The opposition leader, so the leader of the opposition team, sorry, that's pretty self-explanatory, may initially argue that assassination is a severe breach of international law. So there is like a series of things that they have to prove for this to work. So for that to be relevant to the debate, opening opposition has a burden to show that the illegality matters for legitimacy. The first thing they have to prove for their burden of assassination being a severe breach of international law, for that to be important, they have to prove that doing something illegal makes you illegitimate. They have to prove that before that burden that they want to meet to win the debate is true. So for example here, that burden is really strong and something that you can weigh the debate on or make decisions based on. It is strong if the Deputy Prime Minister then states that they accept that assassination is illegal, but they argue, they believe that many acts technically illegal under international law can still be legitimate, and provides arguments towards this conclusion. So basically, if the team themselves confirms that they have a burden in subsequent speeches, that's something that you can hold them to and weigh the debate based on. Does anyone have any questions on burdens? Yes.
Closing teams have to follow the opening team.
Well, yeah, basically in BP, if you are on one side of the bench, so if you're a government team or on the other side, you're in opposition, you can't knife your opening. If you're closing and the other team sets out a case, you can't contradict that case, but you're trying to be the better version of that case, trying to bring even more nuanced examples or more reasoning. If the team before you just makes an indefensible case, they just really do not understand what's going on, and they make just the weirdest arguments ever, there is contentious amongst different judges, but sometimes you can knife them and then the judge will waive it because it's well, what else were you supposed to argue, because they've set up an indefensible case. But that depends on the situation that the debate is in. So if for example, the opening team set themselves a ridiculously high burden that you just can't possibly solve in 14 minutes of speeches, so you just can't win the debate. For example, their burden might be nuclear power ends all war. You probably can't prove that conclusively in 14 minutes of speeches. So what you need to do there is try and shift it slightly, but not in a way that openly contradicts the team. So you can adjust your burden if you're a closing team to something different that's not overtly contradictory, but you don't want to openly say opening team said the wrong things. You want to say opening team was a bit, they didn't have enough reasoning, but that's okay because I'm going to give that reasoning and I'm going to win the debate. You can say those kinds of things, but you can't be they were wrong, we hate them.
So if burden is all good, you can't, even if you're not contradicting, you still can't deviate.
Yeah, you can deviate in that you can take a different path to get there. So you might bring in a different point about, I'll try and think of an example of, you basically just, you've got the same destination, but you can build a different road to get there. it's all about being creative to try and come up with something that's like a little bit different, but that's a challenge of BP. So I'm sure as you learn and watch debates, you'll see how closing teams can be really creative to do that kind of thing. It's not like set in stone in that you're not locked into driving the same road as your opening team. So opening maybe said, this is our burden and this is how we're going to get there. You don't have to do the same thing as them. You can do something different, but you should, for example, if the motion tells you, like in the first example, that you have to prove that law-abiding citizens should be prioritized for vaccination, you have to give different reasons why, that should happen. Okay, I'm conscious of time, so I will try and get through the last bit in 3 minutes so we have time to walk to our next location. Scoring speakers, so fun. Initially, as I said before, your main concern should just be getting the vibe right. Just be thinking about, okay, did I call the debate as it was? And then you can build on things like good reasoning and good speaker scores. But as you go as a judge, you should start to think about, what you're scoring as speakers. So at Worlds, this is direct quote from the judging manual, the average standard of speeches at the tournaments is meant to receive a 75. So in debating, the scoring scale is supposedly from 0 to 100, but because everyone's too nice to each other, no one scores below 60 and no one scores, no one really scores above 90. So usually that's the median range that you're working towards, the average being a 75. So an average would probably look like someone giving pretty sound arguments. They spoke for 7 minutes and, look like they gave a pretty solid average speech. When you see speeches that are, not so great and probably a little bit below that standard, you're looking at something below 75, but unless it's like terrible, or like, that was actively offensive, I hated that so much, I want to go home, you're not scoring below a 70 or, into the low 60s. The range is for like the outliers, right? You're not going to give a pretty normal speech something in the 60s, you're going to give something that was really actively terrible in the low 60s. Reverse is the same, right? If a speech literally blew your mind, changed your perspective on life, like you're a new person after listening to that 7 minutes, some people do give those speeches though, and I don't know how they do it, but I've had my mind blown many times. That's when you should be using the range on the other end, right? You're giving them 80s, you're giving them 85s, you're giving them very, very high speaker scores. But just as a word, most people you'll be scoring from that median of 75. So you probably won't be giving those outliers unless you're in a World's final and everyone was like literally giving the best speech you've ever heard. So you're giving everyone epic scores, or you're in the bin room and everyone wants to go home. They're not speaking for more than a minute because they don't want to be there. So that's when you'd use the range. When you're giving an actual OA, so if you're the chair, then you would have to explain to the teams at the end of the debate why the panel or why you saw the debate in the way that you did. So as an overview, this is what you should do. Firstly, you should announce the ranking to teams. Some judges like to save it till the end. They are literally sadists, like hate them so much. They make you sit there through their long rambly reasoning just to miss when they actually tell you who won or not. Just tell them at the start, be nice, it's really nice. Second thing that you should do is go through the team's order. So you should say, here's my ranking. First was opening opposition, second was closing opposition, third was opening government, and fourth was closing government. Structure of your OAs. So why did opening opposition beat opening government? And then why did opening opposition win over closing government? Why did opening opposition win over closing opposition? You're literally just explaining why you thought that their contribution was the most valuable contribution and why you thought that deserved them getting the #1 ranking. And you would do this with individual clashes. So why did CO get third why did OG get third and why did CG get fourth? Explain that to teams because then it gives them a really conclusive understanding of where they went wrong, where they went well. At the end, you should just give a summary of, reminder, the result was this, and you should also invite teams for more detailed feedback. So if you want, you just say at the end, if you want personal feedback, come and see me, otherwise you're free to go. when you're actually, writing the oral adjudication before you invite the teams in, first decide what the ranking is. Know it before you invite the teams back in, otherwise you're going to confuse everyone. So just write down on a piece of paper where everyone is. Then you should score the speakers, so that you'll be doing this on something called a ballot. A ballot was entered into the tab. So a ballot is where you have everyone's names, speaker scores, where they were. It's just basically a data sheet. You fill that out. Some tournaments, teams are allowed to look at it. Some tournaments, teams aren't allowed to look at it, and it's not released till the end. Or at schools tournaments, never release, never show the children how good or how bad they are. Travis knows because I always had to hide the ballot from him when he was at schools. But yeah, you'll find that out in the judges briefing, depending on what tournament that you're at. Maybe I skipped a slide. No, it just goes from 2 to 4. That's fun. This is meant to say 3 apparently. Third, delivering the adjudication. The actual structure of what you're saying. Firstly, be like, thanks everyone, that was really cool. Here's my order. Secondly, that's the second step. Here's my order. Thirdly, work through each team and why they were more or less persuasive than each other. This can get really boring and tedious, but it's good so that how you be a competitive judge is that you break if the teams think you're a good judge. So you don't want to offend them. So that means that even if the team has lost, what you're trying to do is convince them that they actually did lose. And so to a point where they accept that. Some teams never will, and they'll give you really scathing feedback at a tournament, but you're trying to get good feedback so that you can, make the finals and everyone can think that you're a really good judge. So make sure that as you're developing as a judge, trying to make your reasoning as detailed or as sound as you can. And then finally, give feedback. When you're giving feedback, here's like a checklist of things that you can tell speakers about, even if you, personally don't really know what you're talking about. I know I did this when I worked as a judge at Australs in 2020, and all of the speakers I was judging were way better at debating than me. But don't worry, everyone can always improve, and here's some things that you can tell them. Firstly, structure or signposting. This will be something that you tell lots of the speakers about, especially at schools level. So if they just have one full sentence, they have one sentence and they never stop to take a breath, they never have a full stop in their wall of talking, maybe you could give them feedback about, signposting and structure, and that they can stop. Stopping isn't illegal, and then, you get your flow going better. And it makes you a clearer speaker. Next thing you can do is some speakers, maybe their rebuttal needed to be better. Maybe it wasn't placed very well. Maybe what they prioritized wasn't very efficient. You can give them those kinds of feedback to help them understand both why they did well or didn't do so well, or how they could get even better. Next is have more explanation. Maybe they said really cool things, they had the right idea with what points they picked to run, but they just didn't explain it very well. So you can just tell a speaker, I didn't buy that because you didn't explain it. So please explain it next time, and that would make your speech a lot more informative. Then explain what the outcomes are. This is the logical link that we were talking about before about how you're weighing the debate. Maybe they didn't actually link what the outcomes are to what they were explaining before, and that harmed their speech. Tell them about it if they did. And then finally, some people, the whole debate goes over their heads. This happened to me many, many times as I was learning to debate. What you can do as feedback is sometimes just tell them what the debate was supposed to be about. So maybe if it's a debate about the vaccination one earlier, and they talked about, here's why animals are the most important group in the debate. That's not what the debate is about, right? Tell them that the debate should be about people, or whether people should be incentivized to follow laws, or whether that's unjust and really morally wrong if we try and prioritize people, and those kinds of ideas, so that people know for next time what the debate's meant to be about. Final tips, as I said before, judging is a vibe check. If you get the vibe right, don't worry too much about the reasoning, because as long as you got called the debate right, That's the most important thing at the end of the day. You want the team that won to progress, and you want the team that didn't win to not get those points. You'll be able to learn how to justify whether you got good or bad vibes, but don't overcomplicate it until you're ready. Yeah, judging gets better as you practice, and especially as you watch more debates. You don't even have to like judge a debate to practice. You can just listen to a debate and start practicing things like, oh, well, the earlier speaker said this, so does this make sense? Those kinds of thought processes can help you a lot to develop as a judge and develop as a speaker. If you want to if you want to watch previous debates, we have a show debate on tonight, so everyone should come and watch that. Opening half, it'll be really fun. Or you can watch all of the billions of debates that are recorded on our Facebook page. You could probably find some really cringe ones of me up there from first year. Don't watch those, skip those. But you can watch many of the other more successful people in our society debating at a very high level. Or people now make YouTube channels from tournaments. So if you look up Australs 2020 or Australs 2021 or WUDC 2021, that'll have lots and lots of debates up there from high quality tournaments. You can watch those, listen to those, and you can even choose emotions that are more or less interesting to you. I put all the economics ones on skip, and everything else is quite interesting. Otherwise, that is the end of the seminar. Thank you for listening to me talk for an obscenely long time. That is the end. And if you have any questions, please ask them now. Otherwise, if you want to ask them later, I'm more than happy to answer them.